We're living through the most dangerous geopolitical moment since 1962, and most Americans have no idea how close we are to the edge. Right now, while you're watching this, nuclear-armed powers are positioning themselves in ways we haven't seen in generations. The financial system that's held the world together since Bretton Woods is fracturing before our eyes, and the people running the show aren't just asleep at the wheel, they're actively steering us toward catastrophe. But here's what they're not telling you. This isn't accidental. The current crisis isn't emerging from chaos or miscalculation. It's the result of deliberate policy choices made by a small group of decision-makers who believe they can manage escalation, control outcomes, and remake the global order in their image. They're wrong. History shows us that when empires enter their terminal phase, when reserve currencies lose their privilege, and when military alliances fracture under the weight of competing interests, the margin for error disappears entirely. We're in that moment now, and understanding why, understanding the actual mechanics of how we arrived here, might be the most important thing you do today. Let me start by telling you something that should be obvious but somehow isn't. The world you were promised, the one where democracy spreads, markets integrate, and everyone gets richer together, that world never existed. It was a story, a narrative crafted in the aftermath of the Cold War to justify a particular arrangement of power. And now that arrangement is collapsing, not because of some external enemy or ideological threat, but because the internal contradictions have become impossible to manage. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Western policymakers declared victory not just in a geopolitical struggle but in history itself. They genuinely believed that liberal capitalism had won permanently, that there would be no more great power competition, no more ideological contests, just an endless expansion of Western institutions and Western values. That hubris, that fundamental misreading of how power actually works in the world, set us on the path we're traveling now. Think about what happened in those years after the Cold War ended. The United States didn't build a genuine peace. It didn't create a system of mutual security where former adversaries could find common ground. Instead, it expanded NATO eastward, breaking promises made to Soviet leaders, surrounding Russia with military infrastructure, and treating the largest country on earth as a defeated enemy to be managed rather than a partner to be engaged. Every Russian leader since the collapse, including those who desperately wanted partnership with the West, has warned about this. They've said clearly that NATO expansion toward Russian borders represents an existential threat, but those warnings were dismissed, ignored, treated as the complaints of a has-been power that no longer mattered. And so here we are with Ukraine becoming the flashpoint for a confrontation that could spiral into something none of us can control. But this isn't just about NATO expansion or Russian security concerns. It's about something deeper, something that gets to the heart of how global power actually functions. For the past 80 years, American power has rested on two pillars: military dominance and dollar dominance. The military piece is obvious. Bases in over 100 countries, aircraft carriers projecting power across every ocean, the ability to strike anywhere on the planet within hours. But the dollar piece is actually more important. When the United States convinced the world to trade oil in dollars, when it built a financial system where every significant transaction had to pass through New York, it created a form of power that's almost invisible but absolutely comprehensive. It means that America can sanction countries, freeze their assets, cut them off from the global financial system without firing a shot. It's economic warfare as a routine tool of policy, and for decades it worked brilliantly. Except now, it's not working anymore. When the United States froze Russian foreign exchange reserves in 2022, something like $300 billion, it sent a signal to every other country on earth: your money isn't safe in the Western financial system. If Washington decides it doesn't like your policies, it can simply take your wealth. You can follow every rule, play by every regulation, maintain perfect legal standing, and still wake up one morning to find your assets frozen. China saw this, India saw this, Saudi Arabia saw this, and they started asking a very reasonable question: why should we continue to hold our reserves in dollars and Western financial instruments when they can be weaponized against us at any moment? That question is now driving a fundamental reorganization of global finance, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now expanding to include others, aren't just talking about trading in alternative currencies. They're building alternative payment systems, alternative clearing mechanisms, alternative institutions that can function outside of Western control. The Chinese yuan is increasingly used for commodity transactions. Oil deals are being settled in currencies other than dollars. Central banks are buying gold at rates we haven't seen in decades because gold can't be frozen or sanctioned. This is the controlled demolition of dollar hegemony, and it has profound implications for American power. When the dollar loses its reserve currency status, when the world no longer needs dollars to buy oil or conduct international trade, the United States loses the ability to run massive deficits without consequence. It loses the exorbitant privilege of printing money that the rest of the world has to accept, and that changes everything. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Empires don't give up their privileges voluntarily. They don't accept decline gracefully and retreat into quiet obscurity. History shows us that declining powers become more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more prone to catastrophic miscalculation because the alternative, accepting a diminished role, is psychologically and politically impossible for the leadership class. The British Empire didn't peacefully transition into a modest island nation. It fought 2 world wars trying to maintain its position. The Soviet Union didn't accept its economic failures and reform gradually. It collapsed suddenly, chaotically, taking everyone by surprise. And the American Empire, facing the loss of both its financial and military primacy, is showing all the signs of an establishment that would rather risk everything than accept a multipolar world where it's one power among several. Look at the policy decisions being made right now. The United States is sending long-range missiles to Ukraine and authorizing their use to strike deep into Russian territory. Think about what that means. We're talking about American-made weapons, guided by American satellites, using American intelligence, striking targets hundreds of miles inside a nuclear-armed power. Russian military doctrine explicitly states that such attacks could trigger a nuclear response. Their leadership has said this publicly, repeatedly, in the clearest possible language, and yet the policy continues, escalates even, as if the people making these decisions believe Russia is bluffing, as if they think Putin will back down when pushed hard enough, as if the lessons of every previous great power confrontation have somehow been repealed. This isn't strategy, it's magical thinking. It's the same kind of thinking that led European powers into World War I, believing that a short, decisive conflict would resolve their disputes and restore order. Instead, they got 4 years of industrialized slaughter that destroyed a generation and set the stage for even worse to come. The problem with brinksmanship is that eventually someone miscalculates. Eventually a missile goes astray, or a communication fails, or a field commander makes a decision that his superiors wouldn't have authorized, and suddenly you're in a shooting war between nuclear powers with no clear path to de-escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis gave us a glimpse of how that plays out. 13 days in 1962, when the world came within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation. And that was with leaders on both sides who had experienced World War II, who understood viscerally what total war meant, who were desperate to avoid it. Today's leaders have no such experience, no such restraint. But let's go deeper into why this is happening now, why the confrontation has reached this particular intensity at this particular moment. It's not just about Ukraine or NATO or even the dollar, though all those things matter. It's about the fact that the post-World War II order, the entire structure of international institutions and relationships built under American leadership, is breaking down because it no longer serves the interests of the majority of the world's population. For decades, developing countries were told that if they followed the Washington Consensus, if they privatized their industries, opened their markets, accepted structural adjustment programs from the IMF, they would eventually prosper like the West. Some did, particularly in East Asia, but most didn't. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a system where they exported raw materials cheaply, bought manufactured goods expensively, and accumulated unpayable debts to Western financial institutions. China broke that pattern, and that's why it's become the primary target of American ire. China didn't follow the Washington Consensus. It maintained state control over strategic sectors, managed its capital flows, protected its industries until they could compete globally, and used the Western design system of trade and finance to its own advantage. In 3 decades, it went from a poor agricultural country to the world's largest economy by some measures, and the world's manufacturing powerhouse by any measure. More importantly, it showed other developing countries that there was an alternative path that you didn't have to accept the rules written in Washington and London, that you could develop on your own terms if you were willing to resist pressure. That's the real threat China poses, not military, not ideological, but exemplary. It's proof that the Western development model isn't the only option. And so we get the pivot to Asia, the military encirclement, the trade wars, the tech restrictions, all designed to contain and ultimately reverse Chinese development. But here's the problem, it's not working. China is too big, too integrated into global supply chains, too important to too many countries to be isolated the way the Soviet Union was. When America tries to force countries to choose between Washington and Beijing, most of them are choosing to maintain relationships with both, or quietly tilting toward China because that's where the economic opportunities are. The Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its flaws, represents the largest infrastructure investment program in human history. China is building ports, railways, power plants across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, creating physical connections and economic relationships that don't depend on Western approval. That's a direct challenge to the post-war order, and it's succeeding precisely because that order has failed to deliver for most of the world. Now overlay the Ukraine conflict on top of this. From a Russian perspective, and you have to understand the Russian perspective even if you disagree with it, the war in Ukraine is an existential struggle against NATO expansion and Western encroachment. From an American perspective, at least from the perspective of the policy-making establishment, Ukraine is a proxy war to weaken Russia, to demonstrate that challenging American interests is too costly, to send a message to China and other potential adversaries. Neither side can afford to lose. Russia can't accept a hostile, NATO-armed Ukraine on its border because that genuinely does threaten its security. America can't accept defeat in Ukraine because that would demonstrate that its military support isn't decisive, that its sanctions don't work, that its power is more limited than advertised. So both sides keep escalating, keep pushing forward, keep hoping the other will blink first. But nobody's blinking, and that's the danger. We're in a game of chicken where both drivers have chained themselves to the steering wheel. The off-ramps keep disappearing because accepting any of them would be seen as weakness, as failure, as the beginning of the end for whichever side backed down. This is how wars that nobody wants actually start. Not because leaders sit down and decide to launch World War III, but because the logic of confrontation takes on a life of its own, because institutional momentum becomes impossible to reverse, because the domestic political cost of compromise exceeds the perceived risk of escalation. And here's something most people don't understand. The American foreign policy establishment is deeply divided right now, perhaps more than at any time since Vietnam. There are people in the Pentagon, in the intelligence agencies, in the diplomatic corps who understand exactly how dangerous this situation is and who are desperately trying to prevent further escalation, but they're increasingly sidelined by ideologues who believe that showing weakness to Russia or China would be catastrophic, who think that one more weapon system, one more sanction, one more escalatory step will force the other side to capitulate. This isn't even a coordinated strategy anymore, it's factional warfare inside the American government playing out on the global stage with all of us as potential casualties. The economic dimension makes everything worse. The United States is running historically unprecedented deficits, funding them by issuing debt that the Federal Reserve buys or that flows in from countries that are increasingly questioning whether they want to keep funding American consumption. Interest payments on the national debt are now consuming a larger and larger share of the federal budget, crowding out everything else. Meanwhile, inflation is eroding living standards for ordinary Americans, creating political instability, fueling populist movements on both left and right that reject the establishment consensus. The people who've run American foreign policy for the past 30 years are losing legitimacy at home even as they're losing efficacy abroad. This creates a perverse incentive structure. When you're failing both domestically and internationally, when your policies aren't working and people are starting to notice, the temptation is to create a crisis that overrides everything else, that forces national unity, that justifies emergency measures and emergency spending. War has always served this function for troubled regimes. It's not that anyone wants World War III specifically, but the logic of permanent crisis, of constant threat, of forever war against some enemy or other, that logic serves institutional interests even as it threatens human survival. The truth that nobody wants to say out loud is that the current crisis is fundamentally about whether we're going to have a multipolar world or whether the United States is going to try to maintain unipolar dominance through force. A multipolar world means accepting that other countries, other systems, other ways of organizing society might succeed on their own terms. It means genuine competition, genuine diversity, genuine sovereignty for nations that want it. A unipolar world means American rules, American institutions, American power as the final arbiter of international disputes. The establishment position is that only American leadership can prevent chaos, that only American power can maintain order, that any alternative would be worse, but that's obviously self-serving, and increasingly the rest of the world doesn't believe it. What makes this moment so precarious is that we're in a transition period where the old order is dying, but the new order hasn't been born yet. The institutions built after World War II, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the entire alphabet soup of international organizations, they're not working anymore because they reflect a distribution of power that no longer exists. But we don't have new institutions that reflect current realities, so we're in a kind of institutional vacuum where power is being contested in real time, where the rules are unclear, where nobody knows quite what will trigger what response. And the military technology has changed in ways that make everything more dangerous. Hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, space-based weapons, artificial intelligence in military systems, all of this compresses decision-making time, reduces human oversight, creates possibilities for escalation that didn't exist in previous eras. During the Cold War, leaders had hours or even days to think through responses to crises. Now, with weapon systems that can strike in minutes and cyber attacks that can disable infrastructure instantly, the time available for rational decision-making has collapsed. We're building systems that could start wars faster than humans can stop them, and we're doing it while the geopolitical tensions are higher than they've been in generations. So, where does this leave us? The honest answer is in a very precarious position with no obvious way out. De-escalation would require both sides to make concessions that their domestic political situations won't allow. A frozen conflict would leave all the underlying tensions in place, ready to reignite at any provocation, and continued escalation leads exactly where you think it leads, toward direct military confrontation between nuclear powers. The only real hope is that enough people understand how dangerous this situation is, that enough pressure builds on leaders to step back from the brink, that the institutional momentum toward war can be overcome by a genuine popular demand for peace. But that requires people to understand what's actually happening, to see through the propaganda from all sides, to recognize that this isn't about good guys versus bad guys, but about power structures and interests that have nothing to do with the well-being of ordinary people anywhere. This is why understanding the real dynamics matters. Not so you can pick a side in someone else's fight, but so you can recognize when you're being manipulated into supporting policies that serve elite interests while putting everyone else at risk. The next time you hear a politician or a pundit or an expert telling you that we need to get tougher with Russia or China, that we need to send more weapons, that we need to impose harder sanctions, ask yourself who benefits from this. Does escalation make you safer, or does it increase the risk that your city could be vaporized in a nuclear exchange? Does confrontation improve your economic prospects, or does it divert resources that could be used at home into military spending abroad? These aren't complicated questions, but they're questions that rarely get asked in mainstream discourse because the answers would undermine the entire policy framework. We're at a hinge point in history, one of those moments where decisions made now will reverberate for generations. Either we find a way to build a genuinely multilateral world where different powers coexist and compete peacefully, or we stumble into a catastrophic war that could end civilization as we know it. There's no middle ground anymore, no way to maintain the status quo, because the status quo is already collapsing. And the truly frightening thing is that the people making the crucial decisions seem to have learned nothing from history, seem to believe that this time will be different, that they can manage escalation and control outcomes in ways that have never been possible before. That's not confidence, that's delusion. And it's a delusion that could kill us all.